What is up guys, it's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS4 and PS5 Jailbreak news update. Haven't done one of these videos in quite some time, so we have a bunch of topics to cover in this video. Starting with the PS4, where we have a new beta build of GoldHEN, which is version 2.2.5b8, which adds two new features into GoldHEN. Firstly, we have a scan lines option. So you can see me running a game here. This is Cturt Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. So as you can see here, game is normal. But if I head into the GoldHEN settings and if we go into the overlay options, we now have a new setting in here for scan lines. So you can enable this, and then you have different options for the level of transparency you want for the scan lines. So option 1 will make them the least visible. So if we go back into the game here, you can see in the menu, it's quite obvious that there are scan lines there, although with YouTube's compression, it might be quite difficult to see for you guys. But you can make out the scan lines. But once I actually start getting into the game and we have some fast moving action going on in the game, it's kind of hard to really notice them. But you can, of course, decrease the transparency by going back into the scan lines option and then increasing it to whatever number you want. So if we go to 5, which is the least transparent, which makes the scan lines the most visible, then you can definitely tell here when I go back into the game that we do in fact have scan lines. They're pretty obvious even in game. So this allows you to kind of get a more retro feel for your games, and this should apply to pretty much any PS4 app, and it will kind of give it the CRT screen effect. So if you want that, if you want to make your games look more retro, then you have that option right there. And of course you can just toggle it in the options menu to turn it on and off to your liking. So that's a cool option that's been added there. We also have another option, which if we go into the debug settings option in the GoldHEN menu, we have an option here for the in-game debug menu. Now, this isn't actually a debug menu that runs inside of the game. This is actually an additional option. When you hit the options button next to your game, you will have two new options. One will be the delete option and the other one will be the save data management. Now, that's just a shortcut to save data management. So if you select that, it will just take you to the normal save data management that you would normally have to access through the system settings, but you can get quick access to it here by hitting options on whatever game that you're currently selected over. The other option is the delete option that has a little star next to it, and this will give you more options for deleting the app. Instead of the normal delete option, which will delete the entire game, plus the, any updates that were installed for it and any DLC, any add-ons, it will just delete all of that. Well, this version allows you to choose exactly what you want to delete. So you can just select to delete the patch only. So if you just want to delete the game update, you can do that from this menu. You can also just delete the game or just delete the add-ons. You can, of course, delete temporary content and save data. You can either delete the save data for the current user that you're signed in on, or delete the save files for all users for the game as well. So this is especially useful for deleting game updates, because that's one of the common things where you want to delete a game update without also removing the entire app and reinstalling it. Then you can do so with this quick shortcut instead of having to use a homebrew app like the Homebrew Store or the patch installer, which are kind of the go-to homebrew apps for deleting game updates. So pretty handy stuff right there. Some cool features there that have been added to the latest version of GoldHEN. So that's GoldHEN version 2.2.5b8. So the other thing I wanted to cover here is the whole Revert method, because there has been some renewed discussion about the whole Revert process after I posted my video showing the entire process of taking a jailbreakable PS4, backing up the data for the Revert and then updating it to the latest firmware to play it on PSN, access PSN, and then revert the system back down to that jailbreakable firmware. So Wolo did some digging and found out that it's also possible to revert your PS4 to its previous firmware version without taking any backup. So you can actually do the Revert method without taking a backup. Now, obviously, it's still better to take a backup if you can, because that allows you to revert to whatever firmware you were on when you took the backup, no matter how many times you update in future. Whereas this method of reverting without taking a backup only allows you to revert to whatever firmware version still exists in your inactive partition. So basically there's two partitions on the PS4, like an active partition and an inactive partition. The active partition is the partition your PS4 is booting into that contains the current firmware version that your PS4 is on. So let's say it's 9.03, for example, like you can see in this image here. So what this essentially means is that if you're on 9.03, then let's say you updated from 9.00 to get to 9.03. So basically when you updated from 9.00, 9.03 gets installed in the inactive partition, and then it switches over to that partition once the system software is installed, which means the inactive partition still contains the previous firmware that you updated from. So 9.00 in this case. So essentially what you can do is you can dump your syscon and your S-Flash, and then of course you can use BWE or Better Way Electronics' NOR validator, which has a new option to patch the syscon and S-Flash, which will switch it over to boot into the inactive partition. And then of course you rewrite the syscon and S-Flash back to the PS4. And with the syscon, you'll have to, of course, write it to a blank chip and swap out the chip on the motherboard, just like we did in my Revert video. And then it will boot into the inactive partition, which still contains 9.00 on there. And then you've basically reverted without taking a backup, and you're back on 9.00 from 9.03. So yeah, that is a pretty cool method that's now possible. And also, it has been possible for a while, though I just wasn't aware of it until now. But there are a few caveats to this, which again mean it's a lot better to take a backup if you can. Which is the fact that sometimes 9.00 in this case wouldn't actually be in your inactive partition. Sometimes you might have the same firmware version that you're currently on in your main partition also in the inactive partition. Or you might even have a higher firmware in your inactive partition than your current partition or your active partition. And the reason for that is that if you've reinstalled a recovery firmware in safe mode to fix an issue or reinitialize the PS4, I think, then you may not have the older firmware in the inactive partition. It may have been overwritten. Also, if you have a pending system update that says it's preparing for install in your notifications, then that will also overwrite the firmware in the inactive partition as it's getting ready to switch over to that partition after installing the update. So yeah, there's certain situations here where you could go through the whole process of backing up the syscon and the S-Flash and patching it and then rewriting it back again to a blank chip, only to find out that you have the same firmware on the inactive partition anyway, so you're back in the same place you were when you started, or you could even boot into a higher firmware, which would be even worse. So basically it just makes this pretty much just as risky as the whole reverting method with a backup. But obviously if you've already updated to a higher firmware like 9.03 and you never took a backup when you were on an older firmware, then the fact that you might have a chance of still having the older firmware in your inactive partition means that there is an option to obviously revert back to that firmware version in future. So yeah, still an awesome method right there. And Better Way Electronics, or BWE, has actually made a whole guide for this whole method of reverting without having to take a backup initially. So it's all covered here. I'll leave it linked down in the video description. This covers the entire process, including a method of backing up the syscon without having to remove the chip initially. Although you still have to remove the chip when you write your patched syscon that tells the syscon to boot into the other partition. You still have to write that to a blank chip and then replace the chip on the motherboard with this particular method. Yeah, it's all covered here, so I'll go ahead and leave that down in the video description. But what's more interesting is there's another guide linked here. And this guide actually allows you to do the whole process without having to replace the syscon chip, which is a huge deal because this is the main thing that puts people off doing this, because this is the hardest part of the whole process in my opinion, and of course it is the most risky part where you have the most risk on bricking your PS4. It's the part where you have to remove the syscon chip from the PS4 motherboard so that you can back up the data from it and then write it to a blank chip, write your backup to a blank chip, and then solder that chip back onto that point on the motherboard. Obviously, that has risks. When you're removing the chip, you could rip the pads off. You could, damage the chip with too much heat if you're using like a SMD rework station, or, you could damage the resistors and capacitors that are around the chip. So yeah, there's a lot of risk involved with that method. So this method basically eliminates that, because what it does here, as you can see, it says it uses a proprietary and unreleased exploit on the RL78 chip, and it must be pre-flashed and locked on a fresh Arduino. And it says here, the benefits are that you only have to solder 5 wires to dump, then 3 after that. No desoldering of the syscon chip. You can retain and use the SCE syscon. So that's the default syscon chip that's on the PS4. So yeah, you can basically read the data from the syscon chip in circuit without having to remove the chip and back up the syscon, and then you can write your backup to the syscon again using this unreleased exploit on the RL78 chip. So yeah, that is a pretty big advancement right there. So although there are some things that I believe are missing from this guide, because it does say, you know, where's the rest of the guide and it's to be added. So there's still more to be added here. So this isn't maybe the entire process, but it does cover a lot of it here in this guide. So again, this one will be linked in the description. Now, there is one big downside to this right now, and that is the fact that you need to have the BWE PS4 Syscon writer. And because it uses this unreleased exploit, it's not free. So yeah, if this exploit ever gets released in future, then potentially this whole process could be made cheaper. But right now, you basically need to buy BWE's PS4 SCE Syscon flasher, which costs 180 Australian dollars. But then you also kind of need to pair it with the PS4 NOR validator, which also costs 150 Australian dollars for a lifetime license, which ultimately, if you include shipping, costs 346 Australian dollars, which I checked what that is in UK monies, which is £190, which is about the cost of a new PS4 on eBay. So yeah, you could just buy another PS4 on the latest firmware and have two PS4s, one on the latest firmware and one on the current firmware, or one on the jailbreakable firmware, so you can switch between the PS4s instead of doing the whole revert process, because this literally costs as much as a new PS4. Now, I did suggest to BWE that perhaps he could offer something other than a lifetime license for the NOR validator, because of course, the lifetime license makes perfect sense for repair professionals who are actually using the validator for repair purposes, for repairing consoles every day. But obviously, if you're just using this for the revert, where you're only going to revert it, you know, you're not really going to use the software that often. You're pretty much going to use it once and then be done with it for a long time. So I suggested the potential of having a license for, you know, a day's access of the software, or a week's access, or a month's access, or something like that, instead of a lifetime license. So maybe he could do that, and that would make this make more financial sense, really. But yeah, still pretty awesome. And of course, in future, maybe this whole unreleased method, unreleased exploit could be released for free, and then you could just flash it to your own like Arduino board, and then that would be a lot cheaper as well. But at the moment, you would have to order this and the NOR validator, which doesn't really make sense when you could just buy another PS4 for the same price. But yeah, we'll see. Maybe he'll offer more reasonable license options here for the NOR validator. So anyway, that's all I wanted to cover there for the PS4. So let's move on to the PS5. So there's been a couple of interesting things on the PS5. We have Jose Gonzalez, who has showcased a method of being able to run PS4 games on the PS5 and removing the PS4 game disc without actually losing access to the game. So basically, he has to insert the disc to get the initial authentication. He then has a USB drive plugged into the PS5 and then runs a PS4 game. And after he ran the game, he was able to remove the disc and continue running the game without it kicking him out. He was also able to close the game and then reopen it again without having the disc inserted into the console. So this isn't really a way for piracy to work, because of course, if you reboot the console, then you're not going to be able to run the game anymore. So it doesn't really help with that. And I believe this only works on PS4 games, because he did mention something to do with the emulation, like PS4 emulation, I assume, on the PS5. So it seems unlikely that this will work with PS5 game discs, and he only ever showcases PS4 game discs in the videos that have been posted so far. So it seems to be just a method for PS4 games. So I guess what could you do with this? Well, I suppose you could, you know, insert the game disc, run the game, and then you could take the disc out, give it to somebody else to play while you just keep your console running, and you can continue to play the game. So that's one option, I suppose, but it doesn't really allow for piracy or anything more than that by the looks of things, but still a pretty interesting technique. So next we have EchoStretch, who has fixed the FTP payload for the PS5. There was a file size issue where the file size on the server was incorrect compared to the actual file size of the file. So basically, when you transferred a file on FTP, it would go to 100%, and then it would continue going for quite some time, even though the file was supposed to be at 100%, because of course the actual file size was larger than what the FTP server was reporting the file size to be. So that's been fixed by EchoStretch, so good on him for fixing that. So next we have some information about some exploits, of course. So we've got Cturt, who has posted another report to Sony on the HackerOne bug bounty program. So yeah, so far Cturt has done quite a lot of reports. You've got this one here very recently, just a few days ago. Then you've got this one that was about 2 months old. then there's another one here, it's also 2 months old, and then another one about a year ago. And then, yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of reports here from Cturt, but unfortunately, none of them seem to have been disclosed so far. I don't know if Cturt's just not actually requesting disclosure on these, whereas the Flow normally does. As you can see, a lot of the Flow stuff has been disclosed. So, yeah, I mean, that's a bit disappointing that so far, you know, we've got reports from Cturt going back a year ago that haven't been disclosed here. But, yeah, we also, of course, have the Mastercore exploit, the userland, potential userland exploit, where we got part 1 from Cturt that covered part of that exploit, and there was more investigation work going on to see how far that exploit went, and part 2 still hasn't been posted yet. So it's possible that maybe some of these reports relate to that exploit as well. So yeah, that's basically what we've got going on there on HackerOne. So next we have a couple of things. Now this is a rumor. I wasn't really sure if I should cover this, to be honest, but I'm going to just mention it here. So take this with a fair amount of salt, okay? Because this is just rumors at this stage. So we do have Control Execute on Twitter, who has been right about a lot of things in the past. So he claims that he has a source that has a hypervisor exploit, or he knows that there is definitely a hypervisor exploit for the PS5 that works definitely on firmware 2.50, but might be patched on firmware 4.0. Now, the part about it being patched on 4.0, that is just complete rumor at this stage. We don't really have any concrete information about that at all, although he seems pretty confident about the 2.50 firmware definitely having some kind of hypervisor exploit. However, we don't know when that hypervisor exploit was patched. So he confirms that it has been reported to Sony and it has already been patched, but we don't know exactly what firmware it's been patched in. So it seems like it could be somewhere between 2.50 and 4.0 potentially, but we don't know at this stage. So again, take all that with a grain of salt. We'll have to wait and see if anything concrete comes out or any actual evidence of this. But at the moment, we just have what, you know, Control Execute is reporting. But we do know that there has been a hypervisor exploit out there somewhere, because of course, Fail Overflow did post the symmetric keys, which they could only have accessed, I assume, through some kind of hypervisor exploit, unless they're doing some kind of hardware level stuff. But yeah, generally, we've kind of known that there has been a hypervisor exploit out there somewhere. We just didn't know what firmware version, and we still don't really know what firmware version. Apparently 2.50 for, according to Control Execute anyway, but potentially we don't know when it was patched, maybe 4.0, but that's just a rumor at this stage. So yeah, anyway, that's all I have for this video. Quite a big update there, guys. So hope you guys enjoyed it or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.